Spiritual direction is an ancient art of coming alongside another person and helping that person pay attention to God in their lives, however they experience God, through scripture, through worship, through community, through church history, through nature, through relationships. It helps give a person a time to actually stop and pay attention to that and articulate something that we don't very often articulate. I know when I first started seeing a spiritual director 20 years ago, the thing I most noticed was that I paid attention to experience of grace in my daily life in a way I hadn't before, because I knew someone wanted to hear about it. And I had been in small groups my entire adult life as a Christian. I journaled every day, but I did not pay attention to these experiences of God's grace in the way I did when I knew I would be asked about it. And likewise, one pays attention to one's lack of experience of God's grace. Those places where I, for instance, just don't expect to notice God. So I don't, so to speak, look up. Or places I go or disciplines I engage in that I keep hoping will be channels of God's grace to me, and yet I don't experience them as such. So it brings that kind of awareness to our spiritual lives. And a spiritual director is someone who's trained in listening to that sort of thing and directing attention that way. And actually the ancient word in Greek for director used in this sense is kubernetes. It's the pilot on a boat who comes alongside the captain and says, I think there's a rock out there that we need to avoid. It's not someone who usurps the authority of the person steering the boat, but it's someone who's kind of used to the terrain and can direct attention to the salient features. I first became interested in spiritual direction when I was a graduate student at UC Berkeley. I was studying sociology. I was a fellow with the National Institute of Mental Health. I was working with a lot of psychiatrists and sociologists, and we were very interested in how people get helped with mental health issues. We were working on an iteration of the DSM, this diagnostic manual. And I started to wonder what had happened to the ancient Christian care of souls. All the ministers I knew were referring people to secular professionals. And at that time, in the late 70s, the secular psychotherapeutic professions were consciously free of any kind of religious or spiritual conversation. So the Christians I knew who were seeing therapists, they benefited, but it wasn't a place where they could integrate their faith with their mental health issues. So I was wondering about what happened to this, and I asked a number of people and started reading older books and articles and discovered there had been a practice called spiritual direction, which still survived in the Roman Catholic tradition, Eastern Orthodoxy, and in the Anglican tradition, though I, as an Episcopalian child, had never heard of it. But I think in part because of our culture's radical separation of psychotherapy from anything religious, at least for those decades, it created a gap that allowed spiritual direction to emerge again as a much needed practice. And today it's a fairly healthy practice in a lot of the parts of the world where Christians are seeking this sort of accompaniment. One person comes to me and says, I come in here, my mind racing. My mind is always racing. And it's only in times like this here in spiritual direction, or when I do actually manage to have some hours of Sabbath during a week, that I get in touch with what's going on with me and God. And this person I'm thinking of has a vivid relationship with Jesus in prayer life. But it only sort of surfaces and becomes apparent when the waters are quite still, which they seldom are. And so he, in these still waters of spiritual direction, will have a sense of what Jesus is saying to him, where they actually are. And for a long time, it was experiencing time with Jesus at that fire on the beach, where Jesus welcomes Peter and the other disciples following the resurrection. And this person would experience himself with Jesus there with a lot of the feelings Peter has of, I'm not worthy, I'm not sure I should be here. And from that experience, there was the opportunity to actually hear what Jesus was saying, to receive the gift, and then to preach from that. Not necessarily revealing the story of experiencing Jesus himself, but opening that particular scriptural text with real life to it because he had entered into it and lived it. I'm thinking too of a woman pastor who accompanied a person to her death. It was a profound experience. There were amazing conversations about life and death and what matters. And the conversations were confidential, but telling me about them in spiritual direction, she was able to see what God's message to her was in accompanying that person, and then to preach from that. And that's what I often see with pastors, is that they accompany people in such intimate places that they are fed and moved and changed by what they see in a believer's life. And I think it is God's grace that's meant to flow then through the preacher to the congregation.